I'll never forget the day I'd had enough of staring at my laptop screen in that fancy Chicago office. Rain pelting the windows like it had been mad at me personally. It had been late October, and I'd scrolled through Yelp watching my coffee shop chain, Brewhaven, take a beating worse than a burnt batch of beans. Brewhaven's lost its soul, some gal named Martha had typed, slapping me with 3 stars like a pity prize. Coffee's okay, but the staff acted like you're a ghost. Ronnie had piled on. The one that had really stung? Used to be my second home. Now it's just another corporate snooze fest. 8 years back, I'd built this thing from nothing. One tiny shop in nowhere, Indiana, fueled by hustle and a percolator I'd nabbed at a yard sale. By then, with 22 locations, it had been sliding. Sales down 4 months straight, and I'd been sweating like a hog at a summer barbecue. My regional managers had been about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Just a slow-seasoned Trev. They'd chirped on Zoom, waving slides like I'd buy their bologna sandwich. I'd been 35, not some rookie. I'd learned to trust my gut over their polished nonsense. That gut had hauled me out of dishwater and into that glass box office. And that day, pacing in my hoodie and beat-up Converse, it had hollered, "Something's funky, pal." I couldn't just sit there, sipping latte and watching my dream flop like a fish on a dock. So I cooked up a wild idea. Go undercover, slip into one of my own shops, and see the mess with my own 2 eyes. No suits, no spreadsheets. Just me, a coffee pot, and the unfiltered truth. I grabbed my phone off the desk and pulled up the Brewhaven map. Chicago was a no-go. Too many folks might have clocked me, even with my beard sprouting like a chia pet on steroids. I needed a quiet spot, somewhere I could blend in like wallpaper at a dive bar. Willow Creek had caught my eye. An hour west, population 8,000, one Brewhaven wedged between a hardware joint and a diner slinging biscuits and gravy. I'd cut the ribbon there years ago, grinning like a goof with a styrofoam cup of drip in hand. Nobody'd know me now, but I couldn't just stroll in and beg for a shift. That'd be a rookie move. So I'd hit our internal job board. Jackpot. Barista needed Brewhaven, Willow Creek. Part-time, start ASAP. No experience needed. 2 weeks old. Either they'd been desperate or nobody wanted to sling Joe in that sleepy burg. Either way, it had been my golden ticket. I'd fired off an email from a Bernergy mail. Trev Miller, 29, looking for a fresh start, can start tomorrow, and slapped together a resume that had bore sloth to tears. Dishwasher, gas station cashier, pizza delivery guy. Total nobody vibes. An hour later, ping. Hey Trev, Dan here, Willow Creek manager. You're hired. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Bring ID. My ticker had skipped a beat. Too dang easy. No call, no chit-chat. Had Dan been asleep at the wheel, or was the place a total wreck? Didn't matter, I was in. I'd snagged my faded Cubs cap from the closet, tugged it low over my eyes, and checked the mirror. No slick CO staring back, just a guy with a chipped tooth from a teenage hockey faceplant, and a mug that said, "Don't talk to me till I've had my coffee." I'd look like I belonged behind a greasy spoon counter, not running a chain. Perfect. Next morning, I'd rolled into Willow Creek as the sun peeked out, painting the sky pink like a bad watercolor from a flea market. I'd ditched my fancy ride for my assistant's beat-up Honda Civic, fit the small-town look, you know, and parked a block away, hands in my pockets, strolling like I'd owned the joint, which technically I had. The bell had jangled, loud and tacky, cutting through the coffee grinder's growl. The air had hit me. Burnt beans and day-old cinnamon rolls, a smell that had used to make me proud, but that day just smelled like trouble brewing. 2 folks had been inside. A teenage girl behind the counter, glued to her phone like it had been her oxygen tank, and a stocky guy in his 40s wiping tables with a rag that had looked like it had survived a Civil War reenactment. That had been Dan, I'd figured. He'd squinted at me, voice rough as sandpaper. "You Trev?" I'd nodded, slouching to sell the act. "Yup, here for the job." He'd chucked the rag down like it had insulted his mama. "Good. Last guy bailed mid-shift 2 days back. Left us high and dry. You ever slung coffee?" I'd shrugged, pulling from every dead-end gig I'd survived. Poured some at a gas station. Can't be rocket science, right? Dan had snorted. A half laugh that had said, "You'll see. Newbie. Fine. Espresso machine's yours. Casey'll show you." He jerked his thumb at phone girl. "Don't mess it up. Hot shot. We open in 10. I'd slid behind the counter, tying on an apron that had smelled like bleach and regret. Casey had flicked her eyes up, brown, sharp, ponytail swinging like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Pulled the shot like this," she'd said, yanking the portafilter with a flick that had screamed pro. "Tamped it too hard. It's dirt. Got it." Bored tone. Quick hands. Girl had moves. I'd mimicked her, fumbling just enough to play the part. The machine had hissed, spitting out a decent shot. Casey had raised an eyebrow. Not bad for a rookie. Customers had trickled in. Construction guys in neon vests griping about mud on the site, a mom wrestling a stroller, and a kid with jelly-stained hands, an old-timer with a newspaper under his arm like it had been his shield. I kept my head down, steaming milk, pouring shots, wiping spills. I'd been a champ at this once, back when Brewhaven was just me and a countertop in Indiana. That day, it had been my cover, and I'd nailed it. The morning buzz had kicked in. Chatter, clinking mugs, the steam wand whining like a fussy toddler. I'd started thinking this undercover gig was a bust. Just tired kids and lukewarm Joe. No big drama. When she'd walked in, Edna, her name tag had said it, pinned all crooked on a faded cardigan that had looked older than my grandma's quilt. Maybe 70. Silver hair in a tight bun, eyes darting like she'd been dodging a spotlight. She'd shuffled up, clutching a purse that had seen better decades. "Small black coffee, please," she'd whispered. So quiet I'd had to lean in over-the-counter buzz. I'd punched it in. $2. She'd slid over 2 crumpled singles. Exact change, no nonsense, and leaned closer. "Don't tell my son I'm here, okay?" I'd frozen, hand on the cash drawer. Sure thing, ma'am," I'd said, tossing her a grin to keep it chill. Her lips had twitched. Almost a smile, and she'd peeked back. A guy had strolled past a window, tall, broad, rocking a crisp suit with a camo cap pulled low, typing on his phone like he'd owned the sidewalk. Edna had shrunk into her cardigan like she could have vanished into the linoleum. "He thinks I'm home knitting or some hogwash," she'd muttered, barely audible over the grinder's growl. "Doesn't like me wandering." She'd grab her coffee, hands trembling like she'd seen a ghost, and shuffled to a corner table. Back to the wall, eyes locked on the door like a hawk on a bunny. I'd poured her shot, brain spinning faster than a fidget spinner at kid's birthday bash. This hadn't been just some granny sneaking a caffeine jolt. There'd been real fear in her slump, a whole daytime drama in that whisper. Brewhaven was my pride and joy, supposed to be warm, cozy, a little slice of awesome. So why had she acted like she'd broken out of the clink? I'd shot a glance at Casey, who'd been steaming oat milk like it had been her art project. "She coming a lot?" I'd asked, keeping it low-key. Casey had shrugged, not peeling her eyes off her phone. "Edna?" "Yep, every morning. Chats about her garden sometimes. Harmless old gal." "Harmless?" "Nah, I hadn't bought that for a hot minute." I'd slung a latte to the next guy, a fella in a trucker hat who'd tipped me a dime, and kept watching Edna sip like every drop had been her lifeline. The rush at ease by 10 a.m. Dan had bailed it back, muttering about inventory like it had been his Nobel Prize project, leaving me and Casey with the stragglers, a couple retirees nursing decaf, and a kid doodling on a napkin with a pilfer crayon. I'd wiped the counter, sneaking peeks at Edna. She'd nursed that coffee like she'd been stretching every second away from whatever she fled, her purse hugged tight like it had been her security blanket. I'd been about to pump Casey for more dirt when the door had swung open hard, bell clanging like a fire alarm at a potluck. The camo cap guy had been back. Same suit, same broad shoulders, same phone stuck to his hand like glue. He hadn't ordered, hadn't sat, just stood there, scanning the room with a squint sharper than a hawk's. Edna had flinched, coffee splashing her sleeve, and whispered under her breath, "Oh no, not him again." She grabbed her purse, bolted for the side exit like a jackrabbit on a sugar high, and poof, gone before I could have blinked twice. He hadn't followed. He'd tapped his phone, once, twice, like he'd been texting the White House, then strolled out like he'd never set foot inside. I'd stood there, rag dripping on my Converse, heart thumping like I'd chugged a double espresso on an empty stomach. Casey hadn't noticed, too busy texting her pals about some viral cat video. Dan hadn't cared, still buried in the back counting creamers or whatever. But me? I'd known right then. This wasn't about stale rolls or slow service anymore. Something odd had been brewing in my shop, something I hadn't signed up for. And I'd be darn gayed if I let it perk without figuring it out. Day 2 at Brew Haven had me buzzing like I'd downed a pot of our strongest roast. I'd barely slept after Edna's vanishing act and that camo cap guy's creepy cameo. Her son, I bet my last buck on it, had left me tossing and turning with more questions than a trivia night at the local VFW. I'd ended that first shift knowing I couldn't back off now. Brew Haven was my turf, and I'd been itching to play detective with a smile and a steaming cup. So I'd headed back, ready to peel back the layers of this small-town mystery, like an onion at a barbecue cook-off. I'd rolled into Willow Creek at sunrise, the Honda's tires crunchy over frost like it had been popping nature's bubble wrap. The air had been sharp, the kind that'd wake you up faster than a splash of ice water from Lake Michigan. I'd parked a block away, keeping my cover tighter than a jar of homemade jam, and strolled to the shop, hands jammed in my hoodie pockets. The storefront had greeted me with its usual chip paint charm, the sign flickering like it had been begging for a vacation. I'd pushed through the door, bell chiming like a rusty wind chime, and taken stock. Casey had been behind the counter, scrolling her phone like it had been her morning sermon, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she tapped away. Dan had been in the back. I'd heard him clanging around, probably wrestling with a box of sugar packets, like it had been his personal nemesis. I'd tied on that bleach-soaked apron and jumped in, pouring shots for a guy in a flannel who tipped me a nickel like it had been a big flex. The early crowd had trickled in. Construction fellas grumbling about a late cement delivery, a woman in a puffy coat ordering a latte with extra syrup like she'd been prepping for hibernation, an old-timer with a trucker hat sipping drip coffee like it had been his morning prayer. I'd kept one eye on the door, half expecting Edna to shuffle in with that jittery vibe. And right on time, around 8 a.m., she'd appeared, same faded cardigan that had looked like it had been through a decade of wash cycles, same tight bun, same purse clutched like it had been her shield. She crept up, eyes darting like she'd been dodging a spotlight. "Small black coffee," she'd whispered, sliding those 2 crumpled singles over like it had been a covert drop. I'd nodded, keeping it breezy. "You got it, ma'am." But this time, I'd leaned in a tad, flashing a grin. "Tough morning." She'd blinked, startled, then softened just a hair. "Oh, just needed to stretch my legs." Her voice had quivered, but she'd lingered, like she'd been tempted to spill more. I'd handed her the coffee, letting my fingers brush the cup slow. "Well, we're your pit stop, best Joe in town, right?" She cracked a tiny smile, first one I'd seen, and shuffled her corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door. That's when I'd really tuned into Casey. She'd been more than just a coffee slinger. She'd been the heartbeat of this place. Puffy coat lady had hung around after her latte, venting about her boss forgetting her birthday again. Casey had nodded, tossing what a dingus, and kept steaming like it had been routine. Trucker hat guy had griped about his pickup's busted tailgate, and Casey had fired back. "Sounds like my cousin's old beater, held together with duct tape and prayers." He'd chuckled, loosening up like she'd waved a magic wand. Even the construction crew had swapped jabs with her about the Cubs' latest belly flop. She grinned and said they couldn't hit water if they fell out a boat. I'd watched her juggle orders and banter like a pro, realizing Brew Haven hadn't just been a caffeine stop. It had been a lifeline, and Casey had been the glue keeping it stuck. I'd sidled up to her during a lull, wiping the counter like I'd been aiming for a gold star. "You're the real deal with them," I'd said, nodding at the regulars. "They're here for you, not just a brew, huh?" Casey had smirked, not looking up from her phone. "Yeah, well, somebody's got to play bartender/therapist. Dan's not exactly handing out warm fuzzies. Guy's got the charm of a wet mop." I'd laughed, bang on. Dan had been about as welcoming as a no trespassing sign at a junkyard. But then her smirk had faded, and she glanced at me, eyes sharp as a tack. Look, Trev, don't get too comfy. Dan's been antsy, keeps yapping about cash being tight and maybe trimming shifts. I can't lose this gig. I've got bills stacking up faster than my aunt's coupon hoard. I'd stop mid-wipe, rag dangling like a sad sock. Trimming shifts? Seems plenty busy to me. She'd shrug, voice dropping low. That's what I thought. But Dan's been whining all week about the books. Says corporate's riding him hard. I don't know, man. I need this job. My car's one oil change in the scrap heap, and Mom's on me for rent like I'm her personal piggy bank. I'd nodded, playing it cool, but inside, my brain had been doing somersaults. Corporate was me. I hadn't sent any nasty grams. Sure, sales were down across the chain, but cutting shifts with a line out the door, that had been fishier than a bait shop on Saturday. That's when I clocked Dan. He'd poked his head out from the back, barking, "Casey, quit flapping your gums and restock the lids." She'd rolled her eyes, muttering, "Yes, Your Highness," and shuffled off. But I caught him ducking back into the storeroom, and my nosy streak had kicked into high gear. I'd waited till Casey'd been tied up with a to-go order, some guy in a windbreaker whining about his latte being too milky, then slipped to the back like I'd needed a fresh stack of napkins. The storeroom door had been ajar, and I'd peeked in. Dan had been hunched over a wobbly desk, counting a fat wad of cash, way more than our morning take should have been. He'd stuffed a chunk into an envelope, slid it into a cardboard box under some straws, and grumbled, "That'll keep him off my back." Then he grabbed a bag of stirrers and marched out, nearly catching me as I ducked behind a tower of creamer jugs. My pulse had raced like I'd been chasing a runaway lawnmower. Dan stashing cash? That hadn't been some petty tip jar dip. He'd had a whole side hustle brewing. I'd slipped back to the counter, pouring a drip coffee for a lady with a yapping terrier in a sweater, acting like I hadn't just seen a plot twist bigger than a soap opera season finale. But my mind had been spinning faster than a blender at a smoothie shack. Was he skimming sales? Fudging numbers? And why'd Casey think shifts were getting axed if he'd been sitting on a cash stash? I glanced at Edna, still sipping in her corner, then at Casey, juggling orders like a circus ringmaster. These two had been the soul of this place, and Dan had been pulling some shady nonsense right under their noses. I decided to poke the bear a little. Next time Edna had shuffled up for a refill, same $2, same whisper, I'd leaned in, all casual like, "Hey, Edna, you ever jaw with Dan much?" She'd stiffened, hugging her purse tighter, like it had been her lifeline. "Oh, no, he's always busy. I just come for the coffee, and Casey, she's a sweetie, you know." Her eyes had softened, then darted to the door again. "My son, he doesn't get why I need this. Thinks I should stay cooped up." I'd nodded, tucking that nugget away. "Well, we're glad you're here. Keeps us honest." She flashed another small smile, genuine this time, and headed back to her spot. The day had rolled on, more lattes, more chit-chat. Casey ribbing a regular about the Cubs blowing another lead like it had been a national tragedy. But I'd kept tabs on Dan. He ducked it back 3 more times, each trip with that don't ask swagger that had screamed trouble. By late afternoon, the shop had quieted, just a few folks sipping and flipping through their phones. I'd been scrubbing the espresso machine, humming some old Springsteen tune, when Casey had dropped the bombshell. She'd leaned over, voice hushed like we'd been swapping secrets at a sleepover. "Trev, I overheard Dan on the phone yesterday. Something about keeping it under wraps and they won't notice. I think he's pocketing cash or pulling some funny business. But if I call him out, I'm toast. He'll fire me faster than you can say cold brew." I'd stared at her, rag flopping in my hand. Brain in overdrive. "You dead serious?" She nodded, chewing her lip like it had been her last lifeline. "Yep, serious as a tax bill. I can't lose this. My car's a rolling junk pile, and Mom's on me like a hawk on a field mouse. But Dan's been twitchy, and I don't trust him an inch." I'd forced a grin, playing it smooth. "Well, we'll keep an eye on him, huh? Can't let Sir Grumps-a-lot ruin the party." She'd snorted, easing up a bit. "Sir Grumps-a-lot, nice one, Trev." But inside, I'd been reeling. Casey had confirmed what I'd seen. Dan was up to no good, and it had been bigger than burnt beans. I glanced at Edna, hunched in her corner, then at the storeroom door. The puzzle pieces hadn't snapped together yet, but they'd been piling up like firewood at a bonfire. Brewhaven was supposed to be a cozy haven, not a sneaky side gig. And right then, I'd known I'd stumbled into a twist juicier than a gossip sesh at the beauty parlor. One I'd have to unravel before it boiled over. By the end of day 2, I'd had Dan pegged as a sneaky critter, and Casey's whisper about him pocketing cash had lit a spark under me hotter than a skillet at a pancake breakfast. I'd stood there after that shift, rag dangling like a limp noodle, staring at the storeroom door like it had been hiding the keys to Fort Knox. Edna had still been in her corner, sipping her coffee like it had been her tether to freedom, while Casey had slung orders with a grin that had mastered jitters. I'd known I couldn't let this slide. Brewhaven was my heart and soul, and I'd be darned if some sourpuss manager turned it into his personal cash cow. Day 3 was when I decided to dig in deep and get to the bottom of Dan's little rodeo. I'd rolled into Willow Creek that morning with a Honda, coughing like it had been nursing a cold from the chilly dawn air. The sun had been climbing slow, painting the rooftops orange like it had been brushing on a fresh coat of hope. I'd parked a block away, still flying that Undercover flag, and trudged to the shop, hands stuffed in my hoodie, breath puffing out like I'd been warming up for a fog machine tryout. The storefront had looked as weathered as ever, paint peeling like an old barn, sign blinking like it had been ready to call it a day. I'd pushed through the door, bell chiming like a rusty gate, and scoped the place. Casey had been behind the counter, tinkering with the espresso machine, muttering about its midlife crisis. Dan had been out front for once, wiping tables with that same worn-out rag, grumbling like he'd been forced to smile at a family reunion. I'd tied on my apron, still smelling like bleach in a garage sale gone wrong, and jumped into fray, pouring drip coffee for a guy in a plaid shirt who'd tossed me a nickel like it had been a grand gesture. The morning rush had barreled in. Construction fellas griping about slippery scaffolding, a lady in a quilted jacket ordering a chai latte with enough pumps to sink a ship, an old-timer with USA Today under his arm sipping black coffee, like it had been his daily ritual. Edna had shuffled in right on time. Same cardigan that had been to the ringer, same tight bun, same purse clutched like it had been her lifeline. She'd slid her $2 over, whispered, "Small black coffee," and I'd flashed her a grin big enough to light up a barn dance. "Keeping us in business, huh, Edna?" She'd nodded, a flicker of a smile tugging at her lips, and parked herself in her corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door like always. I'd kept Dan in my sights all morning, watching him shuffle between tables and the counter like a bear who'd missed his morning porridge. He'd snap to Casey, "Quit fiddling with that thing and take orders." And she'd shot back, "Maybe if it wasn't older than my grandpa's tractor, I wouldn't have to." I'd smirked. Those two had been a hoot, but my mission had been clear: get into that storeroom and sniff out Dan's stash. During a lull, when Chai Lady had finally waddled off with her syrup bomb and the old-timer had flipped to the weather page, I grabbed a stack of empty pastry boxes and made my move. Gonna toss these out back. I called to Casey, who'd waved me off, too busy texting her buddies about some Netflix doc she'd stayed up for. The storeroom had been a cramped disaster. Shelves stuffed with creamer tubs, sugar packets spilling like they'd had a wild night, a broom leaning in the corner like it had been on strike. I'd zeroed in on that wobbly desk I'd spotted before. The envelope had still been there, tucked in a cardboard box under some napkins. I glanced at the door, coast clear, and pulled it out. Inside had been a wad of cash, 20s, 10s, a few 5s, plus a stack of flyers that had nearly made me drop my jaw. "Help our veterans. Donate today," in bold red, white, and blue, with a clip art eagle that had looked prouder than a rooster at dawn. But these flyers had been homemade, text crooked, eagle blurry, like they'd been slapped together on a library printer with a grudge. I'd stood there, cash in one hand, flyer in the other, brain spinning like a windmill in a storm. Dan collecting for vets? That had been about as believable as a politician skipping a photo op. I'd heard the storeroom door creak and shoved it all back, spinning around just as Dan had barged in. "What are you poking around for, Trev?" he'd barked, eyes narrowing like I'd swiped his last biscuit. I'd held up the boxes, cool as a cucumber. "Just chucking these. Place is a pig pen. Figure I'd help. He'd grunted, brushing past and to grab a sleeve of cups, but I caught the nervous twitch in his jaw. He'd known I'd been close to something hot. Back at the counter, I'd pour a latte for a gal in a knit scarf who'd tip me with a wink and a penny. But my head had been stuck on those flyers. Was Dan running a half-cocked charity gig, or was he just a sloppy do-gooder? I'd needed more. So when Edna had come up for a refill, I tried digging again. Hey, Edna, you ever see Dan passing out flyers, like for a cause? She'd paused, clutching her purse tighter. Oh, once, I think. Something about veterans. I gave him a few bucks. Thought it'd help my boy. Her voice had dropped, eyes flicking to the door. He was in the Army. Doesn't like me talking or stepping out much. I'd frozen, coffee cup halfway to her hand. Gears grinding. Your son? The guy with the camo cap. She nodded, voice barely a whisper. Yeah, he's proud, you know? Hates folks knowing he's struggling. I come here to breathe, Trev. It's my little escape hatch. She'd taken her refill and shuffled off, leaving me floored. Her son, the vet who'd sent her bolting yesterday, tied to Dan's flyers? That had hit me like a sack of feed corn. I glanced at Casey, steaming milk like she'd been born for it. Then at Dan, now wiping the counter with that same sour mug. Was he cashing in on Edna's hope and her son's story? For some shady side hustle? The day had chugged along. More orders, more banter. Casey ribbing a regular about the Cubs tanking another game like it had been a state emergency. But I kept my focus on Dan. Late afternoon, when the shop had quieted, just a couple of old-timers jawing about gas prices, I cornered him by the register. Hey, Dan, what's with those veteran flyers in the back? You collecting for something noble? He'd flinched, rag pausing mid-swipe, then forced a laugh that had sounded like a tractor backfiring. Oh, that? Just a little side thing. Helping out, you know? Nothing fancy. His eyes had darted to the storeroom, and I'd press harder. Looks like a nice stack back there. Edna said she chipped in. Pretty cool of her. Dan's face had gone from pink to fire truck red faster than a jackrabbit on a hot plate. Edna's got no call yapping about that. He'd snapped, then reeled it in quick. I mean, yeah, it's just small change. Gotta keep it low-key. Don't want corporate sniffing around. I'd nodded, playing dumb as a bag of hammers. Sure, man, just curious. But my gut had bellowed. This fella's full of hot air. I'd let him scurry off, but my wheels had been spinning like a kid's top on a sugar rush. If he'd been square, why the jitters? Why hide it from corporate? A.K.A. me. I'd been chewing on that, pouring it to go drip for a lady with a kid swinging a toy tractor like a lasso, when Edna had waved me over. She looked smaller than ever, hunched in her corner like a sparrow in a squall. Trev, she'd whispered, voice wobbly as a loose tire. I heard you talking to Dan about the flyers. I gave him $50 last week. Thought it'd help my boy, maybe get him some support. Her eyes had welled up, and she'd swiped at him with her sleeve like it had been no biggie. He'd be madder than a wet hen if he knew I was here, or giving money away. But this place is my little lifeline. I'd knelt by her table, keeping my tone soft as a hush at a potluck. Edna, you're solid gold here, okay? Don't fret about that. Why's your son so riled about you leaving? She'd sighed, staring into her coffee like it had held the secrets of the universe. He's a vet, served overseas. Came back different. Doesn't want folks seeing him down or me asking for help. Thinks I should stay put so nobody notices. I'd nodded, pieces clicking like a barn door latch. And Dan's flyers. Did he say where that cash is headed? She'd shaken her head, voice faint as a breeze. Just to help vets. I trusted him. He's the boss here, you know? That had been the kicker that had knocked the wind out of me. I'd stood up, heart racing like a tractor pull at the fair, and glanced at Dan, now barking at Casey to hurry up with that latte. Edna's $50. Her hope for her struggling vet son, mixed up in Dan's sneaky cash pile? I'd known, right? Then I'd stumbled onto something stickier than molasses on a biscuit. Brewhaven was supposed to lift folks up, not play games with their trust. And that twist, Dan may be fleecing a vet's mom, had lit fire in me hotter than a chili cook-off in July. Edna's 50-buck confession about her vet son had landed like a hay bale dropped from the barn loft. I'd been kneeling by her table that third day, heart thumping like a drumline at a Friday night football game, knowing Dan's shady flyer racket wasn't just a hunch. It had been personal, and it had stung deep. Brewhaven was my turf, a warm hug of a place I'd built from scratch, and here was this grump turning it into his own sneaky piggy bank. I'd walked back to counter, pouring a drip coffee for a guy in a plaid shirt like it had been business as usual. But inside, I'd been plotting faster than a squirrel stashing nuts before a blizzard. Day 4 was when I decided to bring the hammer down and sort this tangle out once and for all. I'd rolled into Willow Creek that morning with a Honda, wheezing like it had been hauling a trailer full of regrets. The sky had been gray and heavy, clouds hanging low like they'd been ready to dump a classic Midwest soaker any minute. I'd parked a block away, still keeping that undercover gig tighter than a mason jar lid, and trudged to the shop, hands in my hoodie pockets, breath puffing out like I'd been warming up for a foghorn solo. The storefront had stood there with its chipped paint and tired vibe, sign blinking like it had been pleading for a day off. I'd shoved through the door, bell chiming like a rusty hinge, and sized up the scene. Casey had been behind the counter, wrestling a bag of coffee beans open with a pair of beat-up scissors, muttering about whoever invented these blasted bags. Dan had been out front, stacking chairs like he'd been setting up for a rummage sale, his usual scowl etched deeper than a plow line in a cornfield. I'd tied on my apron, still smelling like bleach and a rummage sale gone south, and dived into Morning Rush, steaming oat milk for a lady in a quilted jacket who'd ordered half foam, half not, like she'd been quizzing me for barista trivia night. The crowd had piled in. Construction guys griping about a late gravel haul, a mom with a stroller juggling a kid who'd been smearing oatmeal on her coat, a retiree with a USA Today sipping drip coffee like it had been his morning sermon. Edna had slipped in right on schedule. Same cardigan that had been patched more times than a barn roof, same tight bun, same purse clutched like it had been her last line of defense. She'd handed me her $2, whispered, small black coffee, and I'd shot her a wink big enough to light up a county fair. "You're our VIP, Edna. Don't let these other folks know." She cracked a small smile, like a sunbeam through a storm cloud, and shuffled her corner, eyes on the door but a tad less jittery. I'd kept Dan in my crosshairs all morning, watching him lumber between the counter and tables like a bear who'd missed his morning honey. He'd bark to Casey, "Quit wrestling that bag and move it." And she'd snap back, "Maybe if you help once, I wouldn't be playing being ninja." I'd grinned. Those two had been a riot, but I'd had one goal, proof. I'd needed hard evidence of Dan's hustle before I could drop the big reveal and clean house. During a quiet spell, when Quilted Jacket had finally strutted off with her latte and the retiree had flipped to the comics, I grabbed a broom and made my play. Gonna sweep up out back. I called to Casey, who'd waved me off, too busy scrolling her phone for some viral puppy clip to care. The storeroom had been its usual mess. Creamer tubs stacked like a shaky card house, sugar packets spilling like confetti after parade, a broom propped up like it had been on permanent coffee break. I'd zoomed in on that wobbly desk, heart racing like I'd been chasing a runaway calf. The box had still been there, buried under napkins that had looked like they'd been through a windstorm. I'd yanked out the envelope. Cash still thick, flyers still shouting, "Help our veterans," in that loud red, white, and blue. But this time, I'd dug deeper, rifling through the junk like a hog rooting for truffles. That's when I'd hit pay dirt, a crumpled receipt from a local print shop, dated last week, for 50 flyers, $12.99. And scribbled on the back in Dan's chicken scratch, "Keep it quiet, Edna's a soft touch." I'd stood there, receipt in hand, steam practically pouring out of my ears like a teapot on a wood stove. Dan hadn't just been collecting cash. He'd been targeting Edna, play her like a cheap fiddle with those phony flyers. I'd heard footsteps and shoved it all back, spinning around as Casey had poked her head in. "Trev, you done playing janitor?" Lines piling up. I'd grinned, holding up the broom like a trophy. Just tidying the homestead, be out in a jiffy. She'd rolled her eyes and ducked out, leaving me to simmer like a pot of chili on a tailgate. I'd had him cold now. Proof he'd been fleecing Edna, and who knew how many others, with his homemade sob story. Back at the counter, I'd whipped up a cappuccino for a guy in a windbreaker who'd tipped me a quarter like he'd been feeling generous, but my brain had been racing faster than a combine at harvest time. I'd needed to nail Dan, but I'd wanted it ironclad. That's when Casey had come through like a champ. She'd sidled up during a breather, voice low as a whisper at a quilting bee. "Trev, I got something big." Last night, I hung back late, caught Dan on the phone out back. Recorded it on my phone, 'cause he's been acting squirrelier than a fox in a henhouse. She pulled out her beat-up iPhone, hit play, and there it had been, Dan's gravelly voice, clear as a bell. "Yeah, I've been pocketing extra. Those saps eat up the vet tail. Nobody's gonna miss a few bucks here and there." I'd listened, jaw tighter than a barn door latch, as he chuckled. "Edna's the jackpot. Keeps it coming. Gotta milk that cow dry." I gaped at Casey, eyes wide as a harvest moon. "You're a freaking genius, Case." She'd smirked, tucking the phone back in her apron. "Yeah, well, I'm not letting Sir Grumsalot tank my gig over his hogwash. What's next?" I grinned, adrenaline pumping like I'd downed a jug of sweet tea. "We're taking him down right now." I'd marched over Dan, who'd been wiping the counter like it had insulted his grandma, and laid out flat. "Hey, Dan, we need to talk about your Veterans Fund and that cash you've been hoarding." He'd frozen, rag mid-swipe, face going pale as a winter pasture. "What are you blabbering about, Trev? You're just a barista. Stay out of my lane." I'd yanked off my apron, tossed it on the counter like a gauntlet, and squared up. "Here's the deal, pal. I'm not just a barista. I'm Trevor King, owner of Brewhaven, all 22 joints. And I've got your little racket on tape." I'd nodded to Casey, who'd held up her phone like it had been a winning bingo card. Hitting play. Dan's voice had echoed through the shop, loud enough for the retirees to perk up, the mom to shush her kid, and the construction guys to pause their gravel rant. Dan's jaw had dropped faster than a bale off a hayrack, eyes darting like a cornered coon. I didn't look. It's not what it sounds like," he'd stammered, hands flapping like a windmill in a gale. I'd cut him off, voice steady as a plow horse. "Can it, Dan? You've been fleecing Edna, using her son's service as your cash grab. You're done." The shop had gone quieter than a church mouse during a sermon, Casey grinning like she'd just won a pie-eating contest. But then Edna had stood up, wobbly as a newborn foal, purse clutched tight like a lifeline. "Trev, wait. Don't fire him yet. He said he'd help my boy. I begged him to keep it quiet. Don't make a fuss. My son can't take it." I'd turned, got twisting like a rope at a tug-of-war. "Edna, he's been lying, pocketing that cash, not helping a soul." She'd shaken her head, eyes wet as a spring rain. "I don't care. I just wanted something for my boy. He'd hate me if this got loud." I'd paused. Wind knocked out of me like I'd been beamed by a fast pitch. Dan had been a weasel, no doubt, but Edna's words had thrown a wrench in my righteous thunder. I glanced at Casey, then back at Dan, who'd been sweating like a hog roast. "All right," I'd said, voice low as a whisper at a barn raising. "We're not done, Dan, but this ain't just about you now. I'm fixing this for Edna." I'd known right then I'd had to rethink the whole dang show. Dan was history. But Edna's heart was riding on this, and that had flipped my plan into a whole new barnyard dance. Edna's shaky plea to keep things quiet had left me standing there in Brewhaven, apron off, feeling like I'd been hit by a runaway tractor. I'd been ready to send Dan packing faster than Jackrabbit at Coyote Convention, but her teary eyes and wobbly voice had flipped my whole strategy like a flapjack at a Sunday brunch. Day for it rapped with me caught between Dan's Weasley excuses and Edna's fragile hope, and I'd realized I couldn't just barrel through like some city slickers swinging a sledgehammer. Day 5 was when I decided to take the reins gentle, fix what Dan had busted, and turn this coffee shop kerfuffle into a win worth hollering about. I'd rolled into Willow Creek that morning with the Honda, wheezing like it had been begging for a tune-up since the Carter years. The sun had peeked out, brushing gold across the frost like it had been painting a "You Got the" sign over the sleepy town. I'd parked a block away, still rocking that undercover look like a pro, and trudged to the shop, hands in my hoodie, breath puffing out like I'd been warming up for a foghorn duet. The storefront had stood there with its chipped paint and weathered charm, sign blinking steady, like it had finally caught its second wind. I'd pushed through the door, bell chiming like a rusty wind chime at a porch party, and taken a quick peek around. Casey had been behind the counter, polishing the espresso machine with a rag and a grin, humming some Luke Bryan riff like she'd been ready to two-step with the coffee pots. Dan had been there too, still on shift, still sour as a lemon pie, stacking cups like he'd been prepping for a sulk-off at the county fair. I'd tied on my apron, still smelling like bleach and a rummage sale reject, and dive into morning bustle, pouring drip coffee for a guy in a plaid jacket who'd griped about his pickups heater going kaput. The rush had rolled in like a Midwest twister. Construction fellas moaning about a new foreman with a whistle and a power trip, a mom in a quilted coat juggling a toddler who'd been waving a half-melted granola bar like a baton, a retiree with a USA Today sipping black coffee while flipping to the pages like it had been his morning ritual since Eisenhower. Edna had slipped in right on time. Same cardigan that had been patched more than a dirt road. Same tight bun. Same purse clutched like it had been her ticket to freedom. She'd slid her $2 over, whispered, "Small black coffee," and I'd flash her a grin warm as a fresh biscuit. "Morning, Edna. You're our lucky charm today." She'd nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips like a flower budding through frost, and shuffled to her corner, eyes on the door but shade less edgy. I'd kept Dan in my sights all morning, letting him stew while I'd pieced together the plan in my head. He'd bark to Casey, "Quit humming that twangy junk and move it." And she'd shout back, "Maybe if you'd lighten up, we'd all hustle faster, Mr. Sunshine." I grinned. Those two had been a hoot and a half. But I'd had Casey in my corner, and she'd been my ace. I'd pulled her aside during a quiet stretch, when the construction guys had cleared out and the retiree had flipped to the sports stats. "Case, today's a reckoning. Dan's gone, but I'm keeping a hush for Edna. You still got that recording." She'd nodded, pulling out her cracked iPhone with a grin slicker than axle grease. "Locked and loaded, Trev. Sir Grumpsalot's toast. What's the word?" I'd leaned in, voice low like we'd been swapping secrets at a barn dance. "I'm firing him, but we're doing it smooth, no big ruckus. Then we're turning this place around proper." I'd waited till the shop had calmed, just a few regulars sipping and chatting, then waved Dan over to the storeroom. "Hey, Dan, need a quick word, stock stuff." He'd grunted, wiping his hands on that worn-out rag like it had been his shield, and followed me back with shuffle that had screamed, "I'm in hot water." The door had clicked shut, and I'd turned, voice firm as a fence post. "Dan, you're done. I've got your voice on tape, receipts from your flyer racket, and Edna's story. $50 she gave you for her vet son, all tucked in your pocket. You're out right now." His face had gone pale as a winter field, jaw flapping like a gate in a gust. Trevor, I swear it wasn't. Look, I can explain." I'd held up a hand, cutting him off sharp. "Save the tall tales, pal. You're lucky I'm not making a spectacle for Edna's sake. Pack your gear and hit the trail. Hey, Charles, send your last check." He'd stood there, sweat beading on his brow like he'd been caught in a July sun, then nodded slow, snagging his jacket off a hook with hands shakier than a leaf in a windstorm. "You're the top dog, huh? Fine, I'm gone." He'd shuffled out, head low like a pup caught chewing the sofa, and I'd watch him go, feeling a mix of relief and a twinge of pity. Fella'd built his own coffin with a butter knife. I'd stepped back into the shop. Casey tossing me a wink from the counter, like we'd just won a blue ribbon at the pie contest. The regulars hadn't flinched, too busy jawing about gas prices over their decoff. I'd pulled Casey and Edna aside that evening, after the last customer had wandered off and the shop had gone quiet, just the hum of the cooler and the satisfying snap of the closed sign flipping over like a victory cheer. We'd settled into a corner booth, me, Casey with her ponytail half loose like she'd been wrestling a hay bale, Edna clutching her purse like it had been her trusty co-pilot. "All right, folks." I'd started, leaning on the table like a coach at a huddle. "Dan's history. No fuss, no muss, just like Edna asked. But we're not parking it there. This place is getting a fresh coat of awesome. Started with you, too." Casey had perked up, eyes wide as a harvest moon. "Hold up. You're not just a new guy with the coffee chops." I grinned, tipping my cap back like a farmer at a barn raising. "Nope. I'm Trevor King, Brewhaven's big wheel, all 22 spots. Been undercover to fix this mess like a regular fella. Edna had blinked, coffee cup trembling in her hands like she'd been holding a jittery kitten. You're the owner? I'd nodded, softening my tone to porch swing gentle. Yup, and I'm sorry it got this tangled, Edna. Dan's out, but I'm setting this right for you and your son. I'd turned to Casey, who'd been grinning like she'd just won a pig-calling contest. Case, you're promoted manager starting now. Bigger paycheck, better hours, and you're steering the ship. She'd hooped, slapping the table like she'd just landed a whopper at the fishing hole. Hot dang. Sir Grumpsalot's gone, and I'm the captain? Sweet as honey. I'd laughed, then leaned back, stretching like I'd just finished a long day in the field. And we're bringing in more hands. No more running ragged. Plus new gear. That coffee machine's getting traded for one that doesn't wheeze like a rusty windmill. Edna had looked at me, eyes shining like headlights on a back road. Trev, you don't have to. I cut her off, soft as a whisper at a tractor pull. Yeah, I do, Edna. And here's the cherry on top. We're launching coffee for heroes. Free cups for vets and their kin. No hoops to jump through. Your son's welcome any time. No one's got to know why. She'd swiped at her eyes with her sleeve, voice faint as a breeze through the pines. He liked that. Bless you, Trev, you're a keeper. I'd nodded, feeling a knot in my throat I hadn't expected, like I'd swallowed a corncob at a picnic. The weeks after had been a whirlwind of hustle and heart. I'd stuck around Willow Creek, trading the hoodie for a clipboard, overseeing the spruce up like a farmer tending a prize patch. Casey had taken the reins like she'd been born to lead. New hires had rolled in, kids from the local high school swapping burger flipping for latte steaming. And the coffee machine had gotten a shiny upgrade that had hummed smoother than a jukebox on a Saturday night. The shop had come alive. Folks laughing over their cups, swapping tales about the Cubs choking another season, lingering like it had been their front porch away from the daily grind. One afternoon, as I'd been packing my gear to head back to Chicago, Edna had caught me by the door, purse still clutched like her faithful road buddy. Trev, she'd said, voice steady as a barn beam, my boy stopped by yesterday. First time since forever. Ordered a coffee, black, no frills, sat right there. She'd pointed to her corner booth, eyes brighter than a bonfire at a hog roast. Said it felt good to step out, smile for first time in ages. That's on you. I'd paused, coffee cup in hand, a warmth spreading through me like a slug of cider on a crisp fall night. Nah, Edna, that's on you sticking by him, and Casey keeping this place humming like a bluegrass band. She'd smiled, wide as a prairie sunset, and shuffled off into the evening, her step lighter than a feather on the wind. I'd stepped outside, the Honda waiting like an old pal under the glow of a street lamp, and taken one last look at Brewhaven. New paint gleaming like a fresh start, sign steady as a lighthouse, folks inside chuckling over their mugs like it had been a family hoedown. I'd known then I'd turned around, not just a shop, but something deeper, something that stuck to your ribs like a plate of biscuits and gravy. And that final kicker, Edna's son stepping out, coffee in hand, had been the sweet finish to this wild ride I'd never seen coming.